Hello friends, welcome back to another exciting video in our Laravel interview preparation series. So today in this video, we will explore and understand a very important part of a web development, that is controllers in Laravel. For a beginner level, there are the possibilities that some questions can be asked in the interview from Laravel controller. So if you have been following along, you know that controllers are an essential part of building web applications in Laravel. In this video, we are going to answer your questions: what are controllers in Laravel and how do you create them? So in this video, we will break it down into simple terms and provide you with practical examples to ensure you can understand the concept of controllers in Laravel. So here, this is the outline of this video, in which we will cover what are the controllers, different types of controller like basic and resource controller. Also, we will create both controllers, basic and resource controller, with example, and inside those controllers we will create some functions, and also we will bind those functions with the routes. So let's start with the very basics. What are the controllers? So controllers are an integral part of MVC, that is model view controller architectural pattern in Laravel. But what does that really mean? In simple words, controllers are the intermediaries between your application's data. So here data refers to model, and the view. So view refers to blade file. They handle the logic of your web applications, and it makes decision, processing data, and responding to user requests. To put it even simpler, think of a controller as a traffic cop that gives direction to your application flow. So when a user interacts with your application, a controller decides how to process that request and what to show on the screen. So to understand it better, let's start with some creating example. Okay, so let's quickly move out to the terminal, and here we will create a controller. Here we already created one Laravel application, so I'm just going to open this in VS Code editor. So here we have opened our project in VS Code editor. So now let's quickly take a look at the folder structure. So here, if you will expand this app folder, then inside app there is one HTTP folder. Inside this HTTP you will find this controllers. So here you can see there is one default controller that is provided by Laravel framework itself. So here, if you will see inside this controller, there is one namespace, that is app HTTP controllers. So here it refers to this directory, that is inside app there is one HTTP folder, and inside this there is one controllers folder. Now here you can see there is one very weird thing if you are unknown from Illuminate words. So here Illuminate, that refers to Laravel package, that components, that is inbuilt one from the core library from where Laravel imports everything. Like if you want to import controllers, models, then you will have to use this Illuminate word. So here you can see this is one class, and inside class this controller, so class name is controller, and it extended our base controller. So here you can see this base controller is imported from Illuminate. So here this Illuminate provides lots of packages, libraries, and core features from Laravel. So it will contain like model, routing, middleware, and many more. And also here you can see there is one line that is use authorize request, validate request. So here this is trait. So here in this base controller, these two traits are already imported. Now let's create our very first controller. So switch back to terminal, and here we will create controller. But before creating a controller, let's say there is some artisan command provided by Laravel. So if you will trigger PHP artisan command, then here you will see a lots of command available. By using this artisan command, you will be able to create controller, model, and many more things. So let's say if you have to create controller, then there is one command, make controller. So you can say there is one command description here that will create a controller class. So now let's say PHP artisan make controller, and here if you will enter now, then this Laravel 10 upgraded prompt appeared here, and it is asking what should be your controller name. Yes, so we have to provide our controller name. Let's suppose I'm going to create one controller, that is test controller. Yes. So in this prompt, I have entered this test controller, that is our controller name. Then now there is one next prompt here. So here it is asking which types of controller would you like to create. So there are various options here. You can see there is empty, resources, singleton, API and invocable. Yes. So empty means by default there won't be any function inside that controller. It will be completely a blank class file only. And if we'll talk about resource controller, then this resource controller will be used for creating a CRUD application kind of thing. So in which there will be predefined methods like create, store, show, edit and destroy. So through these methods, you can perform your actions easily. Also, there is one option to create singleton controller in Laravel. So here the singleton controller refers like there will be only one instance to that controller. So we will see that in upcoming videos. That will be our advanced topics here, because that will be related to our service container and service classes. Also, you can create API controller, like if you want to create any REST API in your Laravel application, then you can create API controller. And at last, there is one option to create invocable class. So the invocable class will executed as a closure function. So you will have to define one invoke function inside that controller. So as of now, I'm just going to create one empty controller first. So either we can just select this option from here, just like by selecting empty, and I will hit enter. So here you can say the controller is created. So now switch back to VS Code editor and come back to controllers folder. And here you can see there is one test controller, and we have created this controller as an empty controller. So now we are here inside this controller. Now let's suppose we have to create a function in order to use this controller. So let's create a very first method inside this controller. So if you are familiar with the class and object property in PHP, then it won't be complicated for you to understand this Laravel controller thing. So let's create a very first function inside this controller. So here you will have to define a property just before the function, like this function will be your public function, private function or protected. As you know, these are the access specifier in object oriented. So here you have to define that as per your need. Like if you don't want to access that function outside this controller, then you have to define that function as a private. So as of now, I'm just going to create a public function inside this controller. So here my first function, and inside this I will just echoing out one message. Hey, this is first function. That's it. So here we have created this function. Now how to execute this function in Laravel in order to see this echo message? So in order to execute this controller function, you will have to create one route. So I have already created one separate video on Laravel routing. So you can check out that video. I will just provide that link in video description itself. So now let's create one route. So here you can create web or API route as well, because it totally depends on your application nature, that if you want to create a REST API, then you have to define that route in api.php, as we already discussed in our previous video. So as of now, I'm just going to create one web route in order to execute this controller function. So let's simply switch to the routes folder. And here inside this routes folder, we have web.php file. So inside this route file, you can see there is one default route, that is slash, and here slash refers to home. So in home, there is one view is returned, that is welcome blade. So now let's run the application first. So we'll trigger PHP artisan serve, and here our application is started on 8000 port. So now let's try to access this 8000 port in your browser, and here you can see that default route returned homepage of Laravel. So now let's create our custom route here just to execute this controller function. So here we will have to define this route : and you have to put methods like get, post, put and delete based on your controller function. So as of now, we have just created one function to display one hello message only. So that requires a get method because we will display that message in the browser. So here we have to define route colon colon get, and then there will be endpoint like what we want to see our URL in the browser. So let's say message, and here you have to specify what this endpoint will trigger. So in the last video we saw like we had created closure functions itself without any controller and view, and we created our logic inside that closure function. As of now we created a controller for this, so we will simply call that controller function here. So in Laravel 10, because currently we are working on Laravel 10, this is the latest version here. So you have to define the controller name inside this array test controller colon colon, and you will have to put class because that controller is a class itself. And then in the second parameter you have to define that function name that will be executed through this endpoint. So here our function name is my first function, so you have to simply put that name, my first function. That's it. Now you will have to import this controller at top. So here you have to import by giving this namespace app http controllers and that controller name, that is test controller. That's it. Now you will be able to access this in the browser. So let's put slash message, and here you can see this displayed one message through controller. Now switch back to controller again. So this time we will try to create one private function itself, like private function, first private function. Hey, this is private function. Okay. So again, if you want to execute this function, again you will require a route. So here you have to copy this, and simply you have to create again one another route, and inside this you have to simply replace this function name. Let me change this to private message. Now let's copy this and come back to the browser, and here let me replace that URL. If I will try to execute that private function, then that won't be accessible here. Let's say, okay, so it thrown one message. This first private function does not exist because we are not able to access that private function in route event. So in order to execute this function outside, you have to make this as a public because we are trying to access this private function in route file. But just outside this class, this private function is not accessible. So again, if we will change this to public, then here you can say we are able to access that function. Okay. So now let's say another thing, like now if we will try to create this method as protected. Okay. So now we have changed this access specifier from private to protected now. And now let's say, are we able to access this? Yes, now protected class is accessible here. So here we have seen one basic controller that we have created here, and we created two functions inside that basic controller, and we tried to use public, private and protected, and we saw that the private function is not accessible outside this controller. So in order to execute that, we have to make either as a public or protected. Now let's come to the resource controller, because we saw in the basic controller we could not see any predefined function that we have to create every functions manually. But in the resource controller we will see there will be some predefined functions already created by Laravel itself. Now let's come to the code again, and here we will create one another controller that will be resource controller. So switch back to terminal. So now let's create one resource controller here. So now again the command will be php artisan make controller, and here we will create one controller. Let's suppose we have created blog controller, and inside this there will be one flag dash dash resource. So this is the second way to create controller, that you can put one flag after controller name dash dash resource. So if you will hit enter, this will create our resource controller. Now switch back to VS Code, and here you can see we have one new controller. This is resource controller, and again inside this controller, this extended our base controller. But now you can see here inside this controller, we have predefined functions that is provided by Laravel itself. So here, this is index function. There is one create, store, show, edit, update, and destroy function. So let me discuss these all functions here. So this index function will be basically used to list out some list of records here. And now there is one create function. So this create function will be used to just open any form in which you will have some list of inputs, and from there you will just submit your data. So when you submit your data from that form, it will come here inside this store function. This will be your post request. By creating this route for resource controller, so we will see these route methods inside the terminal. So again, next we have this show method. So this show method will be used only when you require to display a single record, because you can see here in the parameter itself, it is expecting one parameter that could be either ID, name, or anything. So based on that, this function will populate data. So here you will have to define that logic also, and this is edit. So here there is no any difference between show and edit. Either you can use show or edit, these both will work same, because these two functions expect same parameter. There will be only one. So you can modify these functions according to your need as well, but by default this architecture will be added through Laravel resource route. Now there is one update function here. So this update function requires two parameters. The first one is request. So here this request means form request. From there you will submit your data. And the second, this is expecting one ID key attribute that is considered as a primary key, you can say, and through that ID value it will just update your whole records. And at last there is one destroy function. So this destroy means this will be our delete function here. So if you want to delete any records based on any primary field, that is something ID, as you can see here, it is expecting ID in the parameter itself. So here based on this ID attribute, it will delete your record. So now let's come to the web.php route file here. And as of now, we have not created any route for this resource controller. So if you will try to see the list of available routes in the terminal, then we'll have to enter this command php artisan route colon list, and here let me increase this, and here you can see we have only these two web routes as of now, message and private message. So now let's create our resource route here. So you have to define route, and instead of methods like get, post, put, and delete, the resource controller provides resource method itself. So you have to provide resource here. So inside this resource functions, you will have to define one endpoint name, and that endpoint name will work for all those methods like get, post, put, and delete. So this resource function expects one endpoint name, and in the second argument it will accept controller. So let's put one endpoint name as blocks. Okay, and now in the second argument here we have to put our controller. So there is one difference here in basic route controller and resource route controller. So in the basic route controller, while creating any endpoint route, you have to put that inside array block, and here you have to define your function name as well. That endpoint refers to this function. So here it means this endpoint refers to this function, and here this function is available inside test controller. Now in terms of resource controller, you don't need to put that array, and you don't have to specify the specific function name. The Laravel routing system will understand that automatically. So here you have to just put your controller name as block controller colon class. That's it. Now you have to import this controller at this top. So I will simply duplicate this, and here I will just replace with this block controller. So now let's come to the terminal first, and here now if I will try to rerun that route list command, Then here we can see, here we have the route list. Here you can see these blocks, and it created named route as well, that we already discussed in our previous video. So here blocks.index, this is referring to block controller and index function. Also we have this post method, and here we have blocks, and this is referring to blocks.store, and you can see this is inside block controller, and this is referring to store method. So you can see all these routes are created automatically by defining only resource routes. Now let's quickly come to the browser and change these to blocks. So here it displayed nothing. Yes, because we have not specified anything in the controller function. By default, when we entered /blocks, that means it is accessing our index function. So in the index function, we have to define anything. It's like, hey, this is blog index function. Now again come to the browser and refresh it. So you can see here it displayed this message. So by default, this triggered our index function. In order to create this, you have to put blocks/create. Now /create is redirecting to this create function. So again you can put one message, hey, this is create function. Now come to the browser, and here if you will refresh, then you will be able to see this message. Now if you will come to the terminal again, then here you can see, in order to access the blog.show or blog.update, you have to put parameter in the URL segment. So if you will have any list of blogs, then you can put that ID just like this blog/1, and here that will refer to this show function. Echo, this is blog post having ID of $ID. So let me refresh this function now. So this is a blog post having ID 1. We will change anything, and that will be captured here. So this show function and edit function will work as same. Now in order to use this store, update and destroy function, you required a form, as we discussed earlier. Because browser supports GET request only, so in order to execute this post, put and delete request, you required a form. So we will cover that in our coming video, that we will create a CRUD application using this resource controller. Okay, so as of now we have covered basic controller, resource controller, and we have created custom functions, and we have seen predefined functions inside resource controller. So now there is one important feature, that is constructor, and that is required in any of controller if you will create in your project. So the constructor will be required and to make your code reusable. So let's suppose currently we have created two controllers, just like a basic controller and one resource controller. So by creating one constructor in resource controller, we will try to use our basic controllers function. So let's see how we can achieve that. Here the constructor will be executed before any of these function inside this controller. So let's create one constructor, public function _, and inside this constructor simply we will display one message, hey, this is constructor in controller. That's it. Now switch back to browser, and here if you will refresh, you can see this constructor message is populated before this show method. So this is the use of constructor here. Now to extend this feature of constructor, like how you can use this constructor in different ways, switch back to the code, and here what we can do, we will import our test controller. So here we have this test controller. We already created this basic controller, and what we will do, we will simply import this test controller in our this resource controller, that is blog controller, and inside this blog controller we will instantiate that controller, and using that object we will call any of these function inside this controller. So what we will do, so firstly we will import that test controller in our blog controller, and here in this constructor we will create an object of that test controller, and using that object we will call any of these two functions which are already created inside this test controller. So we will call these functions in blog controller. Okay, so let's start by importing test controller at this top. So here we will have to write use app http, then controllers, and here you will have to write test control, and here inside this block controller class you will have to define one variable. It can be either public, private or protected. So let's say there is test ctrl, that is test controller, and now what we have to do inside this constructor function, we have to call that controller, and inside this we have to instantiate once. So here we will have to create one instance of test controller. Now we have to assign this instance to our public variable. So in order to do that, we have to do this test controller and this instance. That's it. Now we can use this object to call any of these functions available in the test controller. Okay. So now we want to call one function inside this index function. So here what we will do, so we will simply call that function using this object. So here we have this test controller, and inside this test controller we have my first function. Okay, so whenever we will trigger this index function, after this message it will call this my first function. Okay, and whenever it will call this first function, it will display this message. Okay, so now let's come to the browser, and here let me remove this parameter so that we can access the index function by default. Okay, so here you can see, so when we have triggered this slash blocks, it triggered our index function, and inside this index function we have this constructor at this very top, and after this constructor it triggered our index function, and inside this index function this triggered test controller function. Okay, so for simplicity we can put one br tag here and one br tag will be here. So again if we will refresh it, then you can see this is our constructor, this is block functions, and this is our test controller function. Now we are at the end of this video, and here in this video we have covered what is controllers, how you can create controllers, different types of controllers in Laravel. We have created basic controller, resource controller with example, and inside those controllers we have created custom functions. Also we saw how we can use inbuilt functions and how we can connect those functions with routes, and we have created constructor as well. So the controllers in Laravel are like the conductors of an orchestra, just like it directs different components to work together, and it processes requests, performs actions, and decide what the user sees in the browser. Creating controllers is just like a bridge with Laravel's artisan tool, and you can start building complex web applications with ease. I hope this video has given you depth understanding of controllers in Laravel. Practice makes perfect, so go ahead and experiment with controllers in your Laravel projects. Thanks for watching, and if you found this video helpful, please like, share and subscribe for more Laravel tutorials. Also, if you have any questions, suggestions or topics you would like us to cover, please leave them in the comments below. So see you in the next video. Until then, happy coding.